Aarini Devraj's body was found brutally stabbed in her living room, her daughter Mira hiding in terror just a room away, while Detective Callum Strathen uncovered a trail of lies leading from estranged husband Raghav Malhotra to mysterious neighbor Sienna Brant and vengeful ex-colleague Oliver Kade, each carrying secrets dark enough to make them a killer. The morning of the crime began like any other in the quiet suburb where families prided themselves on peace and safety. Neighbors prepared for work, children waited for their school buses, and life seemed routine. But behind the closed curtains of one modest home, a tragedy was unfolding that would soon send shockwaves through the entire community. The body of 32-year-old Aarini Devraj was found inside her living room, lifeless and brutally stabbed. She was a young Indian mother who had worked hard to provide a stable life for her 7-year-old daughter Mira. For friends and neighbors, she was the very image of resilience and kindness, which made the discovery of her murder all the more horrifying. The police were alerted after multiple emergency calls came in, one of them from a panicked neighbor who had noticed the front door slightly ajar. When officers stepped into the house, they were met with a chilling silence that carried the weight of something unnatural. The living room looked eerily undisturbed at first glance. A television remote was still lying on the couch, children's drawings were pinned neatly to the wall, and a family photo frame stood on the mantel. Yet, in the middle of the room, Aarini's body told a different story. The repeated stab wounds across her torso painted a picture of rage, not chance. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, and no ransacked drawers. Whoever had taken her life had been inside that home willingly or had been allowed to enter without hesitation. In another room, officers found Mira. The little girl was huddled under her blanket, frozen with fear, her small hands clutching a stuffed toy. Though unharmed physically, she was in shock, her wide eyes unblinking as though they had seen something she could not put into words. She was swiftly taken into protective care, but the image of her trembling form lingered with the officers who carried her out. For many of them, hardened by years on the job, this case felt different. It was not only the brutality of the murder, but the vulnerability left behind in its wake. News of the killing spread with astonishing speed. Within hours, media vans lined the street, cameras capturing the yellow tape that marked off the Devraj home. The words stabbing, mother, and brutal attack echoed on television screens and social media feeds, sparking both fear and outrage. For the neighborhood, a place where doors were often left unlocked and children played freely, the sense of security shattered in an instant. Detectives began their initial assessments almost immediately. The absence of forced entry suggested familiarity. It was unlikely that a stranger had chosen this home randomly. The precision of the attack hinted at planning rather than impulsive violence. The crime scene spoke volumes, but in fragmented whispers that demanded patience and expertise to interpret. Every trace, from the placement of the body to the untouched belongings, pointed toward a calculated act designed to conceal as much as it revealed. Friends and neighbors were brought in for questioning, many of them struggling to comprehend what had happened. To them, Aarini was not someone who had enemies. She worked part-time at a local shop, took Mira to school daily, and was often seen chatting warmly with those around her. She seemed ordinary, safe, and entirely undeserving of the violence that had taken her life. Yet, the brutality of her murder left no doubt that someone had harbored either resentment or a dangerous obsession. Behind the initial investigation, whispers began to rise. Some speculated about her estranged husband, others pointed fingers toward strangers who had been seen loitering in the area weeks prior. Theories spread faster than facts, but one truth became clear: the killer had walked away undetected, and until they were found, everyone in the community felt at risk. For the detectives assigned to the case, this was only the beginning. They knew that beneath the surface of Aarini's quiet life, secrets would emerge. Secrets that might expose connections no one could have anticipated. What had seemed like the senseless stabbing of a young mother was, in reality, the opening move of a far more sinister puzzle. Detective Callum Strathen took charge of the case, his years of experience telling him that what looked straightforward rarely was. To understand who might have wanted Aarini Devraj dead, he began delving into her personal life. The first and most immediate focus was her relationship with her estranged husband, Raghav Malhotra. They had been separated for nearly a year, and though no official complaints had been filed, neighbors had occasionally overheard heated arguments between the two. Some recalled late-night shouting, the kind of tense exchanges that hinted at deeper fractures. Raghav had struggled with money, often borrowing from friends and failing to repay. Aarini, on the other hand, had been quietly working to rebuild her life, balancing her job and raising her daughter. When questioned, Raghav insisted that he had nothing to do with the crime. He claimed he had been at his own apartment across town on the night of the murder. Yet, his alibi had gaps, and the detectives noticed his responses seemed rehearsed rather than natural. What troubled Callum further was Raghav's lack of visible grief. He was quick to talk about practical matters, such as custody of Mira, and far slower to ask about the details of Aarini's death. For investigators, this behavior was difficult to overlook, though evidence tying him directly to the crime was still lacking. As the team dug deeper, they learned more about Aarini's state of mind in the weeks leading up to her death. She had confided in a colleague that she felt uneasy, as though someone was following her. Friends mentioned she had grown cautious, locking her doors more often, avoiding certain routes when walking home, and appearing withdrawn at gatherings. No one had pressed her to explain, perhaps assuming it was simply the stress of separation and single parenthood. In hindsight, her unease seemed like a warning sign that no one had taken seriously. Detectives also explored her financial situation. Aarini lived modestly, but it became clear that she had been saving carefully for a fresh start. A new apartment was on the horizon, and she had even looked into transferring Mira to a private school. These steps hinted at a desire to distance herself permanently from her past life with Raghav. For someone in his position, weighed down by debt and losing control, such independence could have been threatening. Yet, the investigation couldn't stop at Raghav. Callum believed in widening the circle. He directed his team to interview neighbors and co-workers, hoping to uncover hidden connections. That was when the detectives first heard about Aarini's subtle complaints that someone had been watching her. The neighbor across the street remembered Aarini mentioning a car parked for long hours, with a man inside, but she had laughed it off at the time. Another neighbor said she once saw Aarini looking over her shoulder nervously while bringing groceries inside. These fragmented accounts hinted at a pattern of surveillance, though no one could name the person responsible. Meanwhile, Mira was placed under the care of relatives, but her presence remained central to the case. Child psychologists advised against pressing her for details immediately, but it was clear she might hold memories that could later prove vital. The possibility that the killer had entered the house while Mira was home was deeply unsettling, adding another layer of urgency to the investigation. The community, too, was growing restless. The thought that a murderer had slipped into a home without breaking in made residents wary of everyone around them. Every neighbor now looked at the other with suspicion. Who had access? Who had been close enough to enter without force? The theories began swirling, but Callum kept returning to the same thought. This was not a random act, it was personal. Though suspicion weighed heavily on Raghav, the absence of concrete evidence meant the case could not rest solely on him. There were still unanswered questions about Aarini's work life, her friendships, and whether anyone else might have resented her enough to commit such a crime. What seemed at first like a simple family dispute was expanding into a far more complicated picture. For Callum, the challenge lay not only in identifying suspects, but in untangling the hidden struggles that Aarini had kept from the world. Somewhere in those secrets, he was certain, lay the motive that would lead to her killing. As the days passed, Detective Callum Strathan shifted his attention from the fractured family ties to the neighborhood itself. It was often in these quiet streets that secrets remained buried under polite smiles and routine greetings. One name kept resurfacing in conversations: Sienna Brant, the neighbor who lived just 2 doors down from Aarini Devraj. She was described as quiet and distant, someone who kept mostly to herself, but on the night of the murder, she had been seen lingering outside near Aarini's home. That detail alone made her impossible to ignore. When detectives questioned her, Sienna explained she had simply been out walking her dog. On the surface, her explanation seemed ordinary, but the inconsistencies began to show quickly. She couldn't recall the exact time she had been outside, and when pressed, her account shifted slightly from one version to the next. While her manner was calm, Callum sensed hesitation, as if she was carefully choosing her words. To a seasoned investigator, hesitation was rarely a coincidence. Digging into her background revealed layers that added to the suspicion. Sienna had moved into the neighborhood only 3 years earlier, never building strong ties with those around her. More concerning was what Callum unearthed from her past. She had once been involved in a violent altercation in another city. The case had been quietly closed after insufficient evidence, but the record was there, a shadow she had tried to bear. Suddenly, her image as a reclusive but harmless neighbor no longer seemed convincing. Still, Callum wasn't prepared to label her the killer. Instead, he believed she might be hiding knowledge she feared would entangle her. That theory proved correct when, after repeated questioning, Sienna finally admitted she had seen something the night of Aarini's murder. She described catching sight of a man leaving Aarini's home in the dark, but her fear of becoming a target herself had kept her silent. Even now she avoided specifics, offering vague details about his build and clothing. Her reluctance only deepened the mystery. This confession changed the course of the investigation. If true, it meant the killer had not fled unseen, and Sienna's account could provide the first real break in the case. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood again, looking for security cameras that might have captured movement at the crucial hour. Several cameras from nearby homes and businesses were retrieved, though the quality was grainy. Still, there was enough to show a shadowy figure moving swiftly down the street, disappearing into the night. For Callum, Sienna's story carried another implication. Aarini's killer may not have been alone. If Sienna had noticed one figure, could another have already left unseen? The crime scene's precision hinted at planning, and planning often involved more than one person. The possibility that this was a coordinated act forced the investigation team to widen their scope. As officers continued to analyze her statement, other unsettling details emerged. Several neighbors had noticed Sienna's lights on late into the night in the days leading up to the murder, unusual for someone who usually kept a strict routine. Some speculated she had been watching Aarini's home, though her reasons remained unclear. Was she simply anxious, or did she know more about the victim's private life than she admitted? The discovery of Sienna's violent past fueled whispers throughout the community. Residents who once barely noticed her now spoke of her with suspicion. Rumors painted her as dangerous, though the evidence did not yet support that conclusion. Callum, however, understood the danger of allowing assumptions to dictate an investigation. What mattered was whether her sighting of the man outside Aarini's home could be corroborated. Days of follow-up brought a slight breakthrough. A security camera from a nearby convenience store captured a car idling in the area shortly before the estimated time of death. The car's license plate was partially visible, and it did not belong to anyone in the neighborhood. This clue suggested that the killer might not have been a neighbor at all, but someone who knew Aarini well enough to gain her trust and enter her home. The deeper Callum looked, the more he realized Sienna Brant's silence had delayed crucial progress. Whether from fear or guilt, her withholding of information had almost cost them the chance to catch a lead. She remained a person of interest, but more importantly, her testimony had opened a window to the truth. Aarini's murder was not a random explosion of violence. It was deliberate, precise, and carried out by someone who had carefully chosen the time and place. The investigation now demanded sharper focus, and the path was pointing away from the immediate family alone. Someone else connected to Aarini through her work or past had stepped into the frame, and their identity would bring the case closer to unraveling. The thread of suspicion unraveled further when investigators began looking into Aarini Devraj's professional life. Though she had worked part-time at a local shop in recent years, Records showed that she had previously been employed at a mid-sized corporate office. One name kept surfacing as detectives sifted through her history: Oliver Kade. He was a former co-worker whose reputation had been clouded by troubling incidents. Years earlier, Aarini had quietly filed a complaint against him for harassment. While the matter never went to court, the workplace had dismissed Oliver soon after. His departure had been abrupt, and those who remembered him described a man prone to anger, resentment, and erratic behavior. Detective Callum Strathan's instincts told him this thread was worth pulling. The timing was damning. Only days after Aarini's death, Oliver had vanished from his usual routines. His phone was switched off, his apartment left in disarray, and his vehicle missing. When investigators traced local surveillance systems, they uncovered footage of a car resembling his near Aarini's neighborhood on the night of the murder. Though grainy and lacking in detail, the image was enough to raise alarm. The idea of Oliver being involved brought with it a disturbing possibility. Unlike the estranged husband, who had financial motives and personal grievances, Oliver's link was more sinister. His past interactions with Aarini suggested fixation, possibly obsession. If he had harbored anger from being dismissed and humiliated years earlier, the motive might be revenge. This angle shifted the investigation's momentum, broadening the scope beyond the immediate family and neighbors. But as investigators looked closer, an odd pattern emerged. The murder scene had not shown typical signs of a chaotic, emotionally charged attack. Instead, the stabbings were deliberate, targeted, and almost clinical. Oliver, with his unstable personality, would have been more likely to lash out recklessly. The calculated nature of the crime raised doubts that he had acted alone, if at all. Callum began considering that Oliver might have been manipulated, framed, or even used as a distraction. Interviews with former colleagues painted a picture of a man spiraling downward. After losing his job, Oliver drifted between temporary employment and short-lived housing arrangements. He often complained about Aarini, blaming her for ruining his life, and once was overheard saying she would pay for what she did. These words, taken in hindsight, sounded ominous, but spoken years earlier, they had been brushed aside as bitter ramblings. Now they carried an entirely new weight. A breakthrough came when a discarded glove was recovered near a drainage ditch, not far from Aarini's home. Forensic testing revealed traces of Oliver's DNA mixed with blood belonging to the victim. The discovery seemed damning, yet the glove's placement felt almost too convenient. It was positioned in a spot that would be easily noticed during routine patrols, unlike something hastily discarded by someone fleeing in panic. Callum suspected it might have been planted. Adding to the complexity was Oliver's sudden disappearance. For someone supposedly guilty of murder, he had left behind no clear escape trail. His bank accounts were untouched, his credit cards unused, and no sightings confirmed his presence elsewhere. It was as though he had been swallowed by the earth. This absence raised chilling questions. Had he gone into hiding, or had someone ensured he could not be found? The media seized on the new suspect, painting Oliver as a monster who had finally acted on his grudge. Headlines carried his name, and his image spread across screens, fueling fear and fascination. Yet behind closed doors, Callum and his team remained cautious. They knew the danger of accepting an easy answer. If Oliver was truly guilty, why were there so many signs suggesting deliberate staging? And if he was not the killer, then the real murderer was still weaving the narrative from the shadows. For Aarini's grieving family, the idea that her death was linked to someone from her past life added another layer of heartbreak. To them, she had moved on, built a new life, and distanced herself from old troubles. The notion that the past had clawed its way back in such a violent fashion was devastating. For investigators, however, this was the essence of the case. Every step forward revealed not just answers, but deeper questions. As the fourth week of the investigation approached, the pieces on the board were shifting. Suspicion still hovered over Raghav, the estranged husband, yet Oliver's resurfaced history complicated the narrative. One man with financial desperation, another with years of festering resentment. Either could have killed Aarini, but the possibility that both were entangled in the same web of deceit was becoming harder to ignore. As weeks of investigation stretched into a tense month, the case reached a critical point. Commissioner Helena Voss, aware of mounting public pressure and restless media scrutiny, announced a staggering $1 million reward for information leading to the killer's capture. The decision was both tactical and symbolic. It signaled desperation, but it also placed enormous pressure on the community. Suddenly, neighbors who had once remained silent began offering tips. Some leads were wild speculation, but others provided small fragments that helped sharpen the picture. Among the fragments was a detail easily overlooked in the chaos of the first days. Forensic analysts re-examining the crime scene discovered something new. Faint traces of blood on Aarini's doorknob, a spot missed in the initial sweep. DNA testing confirmed the sample belonged to Raghav Malhotra, Aarini's estranged husband. He had insisted he hadn't visited her home for weeks, yet science now placed him at the very threshold on the night she was murdered. Detective Callum Strathan saw this as the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The discovery reframed the entire investigation. While Oliver Kade remained a suspicious figure, especially with his sudden disappearance, the physical evidence against Raghav was undeniable. Under discreet surveillance, investigators observed Raghav behaving nervously. He made repeated trips to a storage unit late at night, carrying bags and boxes inside. When officers eventually moved in, they uncovered clothing stained with blood and documents tying him to mounting debt. He had been drowning financially, desperate for control, and increasingly bitter that Aarini was building a new life without him. The narrative began to shift. It appeared Raghav had orchestrated the killing out of jealousy and rage, driven by the fear of losing both his daughter and the financial foothold he still clung to. But questions remained. What role did Oliver play, if any? The conveniently placed glove, the grainy footage of his car, and his history with Aarini seemed too connected to dismiss as coincidence. Callum began to piece together the possibility that Oliver had been deliberately used as a scapegoat. If suspicion focused on him, Raghav could deflect attention long enough to erase his own trail. The deeper investigators dug, the more evidence supported this theory. Witnesses reported seeing Raghav and Oliver together at a bar several months before the murder, an unusual pairing given their differences. Phone records hinted at sporadic contact between the two men, though Raghav denied any association. The chilling conclusion was that Raghav had likely dangled promises, or manipulated Oliver in some way, either drawing him close enough to involve him, or planting evidence to ensure blame would fall squarely on him once the crime was done. When police confronted Raghav with the forensic evidence, his carefully maintained facade began to crumble. He attempted to claim he had visited the house weeks earlier, but the timeline could not support his defense. The blood on the doorknob was fresh, and the items in his storage unit betrayed efforts to conceal the truth. His arrest was swift, carried out in the early hours of morning before he could attempt another move. The community erupted in mixed emotion. Relief washed through the neighborhood at the news of his capture, but sorrow remained heavy. Aarini's murder had not been the result of a faceless intruder, or a random act of violence. It had been committed by someone who once shared her home, someone she had once trusted. The betrayal cut deep, leaving scars that no amount of justice could fully heal. Oliver's fate, however, remained a haunting mystery. Despite extensive searches, he was never located. Whether he had fled in fear, been silenced, or vanished by choice, no definitive answers surfaced. For some, he lingered as a ghost of suspicion, a reminder that parts of the story might forever remain in the shadows. In the end, Raghav Malhotra was charged with the murder of Aarini Devraj. His calculated rage laid bare for the courts to dissect. The $1 million reward had played its part, drawing out voices that helped connect the missing threads. Yet even as justice moved forward, the tragedy continued to echo. For Mira, the little girl who had hidden in her bedroom as her world collapsed, no verdict could erase the night that stole her mother. For the neighborhood, once trusting and carefree, the murder remained a dark chapter etched into memory, proof that evil can hide behind the most familiar of doors.